and give you your proper introduction, if that sounds all right, and we'll get going. So thank you so much, Professor Dr. David Stadelmann, for joining us. It's such a pleasure. For those of you who aren't aware, Professor Stadelmann has a very, very impressive background here, the doctorate in economics and social sciences, with many, many awards over the years, top 40 under 40 in 2018 and otherwise, with many peer-reviewed publications in economic letters, Journal of Economic Behavioral Organization, Social Sciences Quarterly, just to name a few. Today, Professor Stadelmann will be talking a little bit about certified coronavirus immunity as a resource and strategy to cope with pandemic costs. Bit of a timely topic, so we're very lucky to have him. And just as a reminder, feel free at any point to pose questions. You can use the chat box and either just do it to everyone, and you can start a bit of a dialogue and discussion going, that's fine. Or if you want to direct a question directly to me, that's completely fine as well. Otherwise, when we get to the question and answer format, after Professor Stadelmann's remarks, then you can use the raise hand feature. And you can either unmute and pose your question, or I'm happy to moderate via the chat window as well. Whatever you're most comfortable with. My guess is we're going to have a fair number of questions and a pretty lively conversation. So my only suggestion would be try to keep it pretty direct, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. So kind of short and to the point, if you wouldn't mind. So thank you so much for joining us again, Dr. Stadelmann, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Scott. It's a real pleasure to be back in Bloomington, at least digitally. So I've prepared roughly 10 minutes with some slides where I would like to introduce you to the topic so that we can discuss it. I will share the slides now.
That sounds great.
This may take some time, okay. I hope you can see them already. So this is the paper that I would like to present. It's entitled Certified Coronavirus Immunity as a Resource and Strategy to Cope with Pandemic Costs. It's joint work with Rainer Eichenberger, Rainer Hexelmann, David Savage, and Benno Torgler. So what are we arguing? What do we want to say actually? Hold on, there we are. So the current COVID pandemic is unfolding, it's not only actually a biological event, but also an economic disaster. Consequently, we think it's imperative to understand the impacts from a societal and an economic perspective. And the classical economic perspective always focuses on resources. And focusing on resources implies that opportunity costs must be considered, and every decision involves trade-offs. Now, as the disease spreads, a crucial resource for overcoming the crisis is growing, and it's actually growing exponentially. People with immunity to SARS-CoV-2, people with immunity to coronavirus are growing in the numbers. We argue that this resource must be employed, certified, searched for, found, and it may even be actively produced. Immune individuals may be the most important resource in the fight against coronavirus, even if it's only partial immunity, because even that would allow them to return to normal economic employment and social activity immediately. Not as fast as possible, but we're talking here about immediately. They could also work directly with the health support infrastructure, of course, on a voluntary basis. I've heard that Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, has done precisely that. So he went to hospital after being infected with coronavirus. He recovered and he continued to work in local hospital. But in order to be employed and to be active again, immunity must be certified, and immune people must be distinguishable from the non-immune. And this is why you need a immunity certificate. You may also call it an immunity passport. I'd like to highlight that this already exists, or at least people are thinking about that. We are working here also with an initiative in Switzerland called Corona Immunity. For the moment, I think you see you see this initiative on the internet. For the moment, this is mostly to register people who want to get the immunity tests, and then these tests will be rolled out. And for the moment, it's not clear if government is also issuing the certificates or if it's these medical insurance companies, medical insurance providers, which will be issuing the certificates. There are also, of course, opportunities to use blockchain technology. So the coronavirus passport is being developed with blockchain technology. I'm not sure if we really need all that, or if a simple card will do, but things are going on, and they're going on relatively quickly. So an immunity certificate is central. Like other valuable resources, immune people must be searched for, and this requires, of course, broad testing, not only for the illness, but also for antibodies. Because testing for antibodies will find previously infected people who were asymptomatic and who are now already immune. Antibodies from immune people can also be sourced to provide a serum as a potential treatment if we don't find a vaccine relatively soon, which is quite realistic that it will take time to find a vaccine. Immunity certificates will help then to find people who have contracted coronavirus, because it allows them to return to social activities. Healthy people who have been infected may recall symptoms, although they were not registered. So, for example, a typical symptom seems to be loss of smell and loss of taste. And of course, cooperation with authorities is rewarded by receiving a certificate. I would like to highlight that it need not be governments that issue the immunity certificates. Trusted private organizations can also step in and provide certificates. Moreover, immunity certificates need not only be issued to national citizens, but they will always be important for global trade and exchange, which needs to come back quickly. And you may also issue it to foreigners. So there is no reason why Switzerland or Germany shouldn't issue immunity certificates to foreigners. Finally, like all other resources, immunity may be actively produced, as individuals may want to seek immunity voluntarily under medical supervision, of course, through self-infection, particularly for cohorts with lower risks of severe consequences. Now, we have been in discussions with scientific organizations here in Germany, and of course we have heard a lot of counter-arguments. So, but I think we have a very robust way to go forward. It's not the only way, of course, but it's always a way which is complementary to other ways that can be followed out of this crisis. And I would like to highlight some of the counter-arguments now, and I would like to refute them, of course. That's even more important. So some people have been arguing that immunity is not certain. Yes, that's true. But of course, it's better to rely on persons with partial immunity than on persons with no immunity at all. Moreover, virtually all government strategies rely to a good extent on people developing immunity. You don't need to search for a vaccine if you think that immunity is uncertain. Some people have argued that there are not enough immune people. This is actually wrong. The number of unreported cases is high, and it's even a factor between 5 to 100. Now, at present, for example, in the United States, we have roughly 800,000 people infected with coronavirus. And this is only the registered people. If you multiply this by the number of unreported cases, and you make a realistic factor of 10 to 20, according to the Robert Koch Institute in Germany, then you have a few million people already, roughly 5% of the population. Now, this is far more, this is a far higher number of people who are immune than for example, people who consider themselves as non-binary gender, so neither male nor female. So there is a large number of immune people already. Some people say, well, there is not enough testing capacity. Well, yes, that's true currently, but testing capacity is increasing rapidly. And of course, you can start testing for antibodies in infection hotspots. Now, this testing issue is quite interesting because it allows us to generate a hypothesis. In systems where health services are quite elastic, so where health supply can increase flexibly, there we would think that more testing is possible relatively quickly. So we should not only look at the demand side for tests, but also at the supply side. And if supply is more flexible, then we should see more testing. Now I go on. There may be mutations of the virus. Yes, that's a counter argument. But again, even partial immunity to some strains, then you may also want a certificate. And again, if mutations happen, then this affects all government strategies, like it affects our strategy. So ours is just complementary at any point. Some people have said, well, immunity certificates will generate inequality. Yes, maybe, but only for a short time, because the more people get infected, the lower the individual value of the immunity as a resource is. Because the more resources we have, well, the lower the value of individual immunity. If you really think that you want to lock up immune people because you don't like inequality at all, then you should rather go forward and say, well, immunity certificates can be issued at the price, and the proceeds can then be redistributed. So free up the resources of immune people and distribute the proceeds if you hate inequality. But I would just free them. I don't see any reason why they should be locked up. Some people may want to self-infect to get the certificate. Yes, but this is already happening actually. And I think that immunity certificates can help to prevent an uncontrolled self-infection, and they permit sensible cooperation with the authorities. Finally, some people have said, well, we need a heart and not an exit strategy. I think that analyzing large and important problems with a heart means that you have to analyze them rationally, and this particularly holds for decision makers. In emergency situations, we want rational decisions and not decisions that are guided by feelings. I highlight two additional smaller points which are in the paper. One is that we need to prevent, I think, behavioral infection. What do I mean by that? The virus has so far not only infected our bodies, but I really see that it has infected the minds of many people. People are really afraid, and the measures that they take to some extent are excessive. If you think about it, the coronavirus crisis was triggered by a specific severity profile related to the disease. We have a combination of very serious symptoms, which mainly affect the elderly and those with comorbidities, together with a very high reproduction rate of the virus. Consequently, clinics need urgent supplies of scarce resources, such as ventilators and specialist units that can use them. Thus, hospital risk being overwhelmed, and this may require triage. Had the virus encountered the medical system equipped with these resources already, then these resources will be available in the next few months in rich countries, then there would not have been a crisis. We have to realize that. The virus' direct health consequences would probably have been more like a severe or pandemic influenza. And this may ultimately still be the case. Many governments are nevertheless imposing travel restrictions and lockdowns because they fear triage situations and they want to minimize triage situations. But minimizing triage is not the same as minimizing deaths, and we have to realize that too. So governments tend to forget that lockdowns will lead very quickly to enormous and lasting economic and social devastation with further damages to the general health system. There are also psychological impacts, of course, due to quarantine, which have been explored. And there will be many deaths due to economic deprivation. In some countries, particularly the poor ones, these deaths will be due to starvation and not due to coronavirus, or these will be the side effects. Again, analyzing and solving enormous problems with hard requires analyzing them rationally. And the side effects of the imposed cure are likely to be worse than the health disease itself. I don't go into injustice and inequality of infection. I just highlight one point. Of course, the infection is discriminating against elderly people with comorbidities, but also the lockdown measures are discriminating. And they are discriminating differently, of course. There are some groups like us who can easily, so like us academics, who can easily work at home and stay at home. But of course, production workers need to go and work in the production sector. The youngsters who came out of university, they will have difficulties finding jobs, etc., etc. So we are already experiencing large forms of inequality, not only due to the virus discriminating in the health sector, but due to social inequality going on. I think to conclude, I just want to formulate a few hypotheses. One is that I think that in countries where the supply of health services is more elastic and where the regulation of labor markets and other factor markets is more flexible, I expect better management and to see fewer deaths as a fraction of infected people. We will also see more testing there. And I think we have to think about the side effects of societal infections already. It will be difficult to distinguish them, and it will be difficult to distinguish whether the cure has really been worse than disease. However, there are sectors where the negative side effects of government measures against the crisis can be easily investigated. We expect that online gambling, alcoholism, domestic violence, divorces, obesity, suicides of non-infected people will decrease. And these are vast side effects, and we need to talk about them. Thank you. I would be open for your questions. I stopped the slides.
Oh, that's fine. No, that was really well done. Thank you so much. Well, first off, virtual round of applause. That was great. As again, very, very timely and cogent. It looks like the first person, we have a couple, of course, but we'll start with Leandra. If you'd like to go ahead and either just unmute, Leandra, please feel free, or if you want me to moderate, just put it in the chat box, and then we'll go on to Brian.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you for that very interesting talk. This is obviously a very pressing topic, and I think the idea of testing for antibodies is terrific. I just wanted to question whether the state of scientific knowledge right now as to whether having antibodies makes you immune or partially immune is sufficient to actually certify people to return to work or return to sort of normal functioning in society, or whether there's risks of that such that we should wait so that the scientific knowledge develops further so that we know more about how immune people get and how long that immunity lasts.
Yeah. The answer is the following. The probability of contracting exactly the same virus a second time within a few months or even years and passing the disease on is very small compared to the first occurrence of the illness. Peter Doherty, who received the Nobel Prize for discovering how the immune system identifies cells that have been infected by a virus, recently argued that the first reports that have come out of South Korea that you can contract COVID-19 twice are unlikely to be correct. Probably it's the tests for whether you are infected or not that are relatively bad. So they give you false positives and false negatives. Furthermore, he is suggesting that even if there is reinfection, which can happen, prior infection would give you an individual degree of immunity, and you would recover relatively quickly from the illness. In addition, it seems that the virus has not rapidly mutated so far, which could indicate that immunity confers a long-term protection. There is evidence that SARS, so if you contracted SARS, which is far worse for certain than coronavirus, it gives you immunity of up to 2 years. I also noted that vaccinations do not give you full immunity. If you have an influenza vaccination, you are not fully immune even against the strains that the influenza vaccine targets. So immunity, again, it's not certain, but it's highly likely. And we humans have evolved with pathogens, with viruses over a long evolutionary period. So it would be very surprising if there was no immunity at all. I expect relatively high immunity.
Well done. Great question. Landry, do you have any follow-up, or is that okay?
Sorry, I needed to unmute. Yeah, that's fine. I did see that in the paper. And I guess it's just, it does seem like there's still a lot of guesswork. I mean, these are sort of arguments about what the likelihood of immunity is. And that's really what I was pushing on is, you know, is it too soon now? This is a really important, but potentially high risk decision.
Yep.
I think you can't do the testing that quickly in any case. So what we are seeing is that the large pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland, together with insurance organizations, are just preparing for the tests. So Hoffmann, La Roche, etc., they will be out with quite reliable tests for immunity relatively soon. We have experiences that those who have contracted the virus already in January, that they have developed antibodies against the virus. How long this immunity will hold is, of course, still unclear. But I don't see why we should wait now and not prepare everything already, that get the immunity passports running as quickly as possible, ideally immediately. Cool. So I think this is a way forward, and there is no reason to wait. We are all navigated uncharted waters in any case. And importantly, all the government measures are also increasing costs, and they are costing real lives. Mm-hmm. So we have to weigh the uncertainty if immunity is really certain against the uncertainty of everything else that we are doing. So it would be wrong not to consider it and not to prepare it immediately.
That's great. Thank you, David. And it looks like Brian's next.
Okay, this is kind of the same topic, and in a sense, asking, couldn't it be possible and helpful to kind of put those uncertainties into a clearer framework?
Yeah.
You may well have seen this one of the papers that was influential by Thomas Pueyo and colleagues, The Hammer and the Dance, which to me seemed a really excellent example of presenting in a model in a way that exposes these assumptions and lets people think about, okay, when we have better information about some of these parameters, how things might change.
Yeah.
And so I guess my partially comment, suggestion, or question, to what extent can you kind of do sensitivity analysis of what here, I'm sorry, comes across very much as an argument, advocacy for a particular position, saying, okay, here's some papers that point out these problems may be happening, and bring it into a more systematic and perhaps Bayesian framework that says, as we understand better about immunity and how good or bad or weak that immunity may be and other parameters, we could make more intelligent choices about this kind of decision.
Yes, I think that all evidence needs to be considered, and of course mathematical modeling is being done at the same time. So you're right, this is an argument here, so this paper is building an argument, but at the same time there are mathematical models running, and we are working together with mathematicians too. For example, we have already a model which shows that active immunization, so getting voluntary infection, can work if these people then work mainly in the health sector and do not need as much equipment there. Now, what we are observing, I think, is that at the beginning in January, we had WHO data which gave a mortality of the disease of roughly 3.5%. It was the case mortality rate. Then we had relatively soon the Diamond Princess, that cruise ship, where we had a closed system, which is great because it's a natural experiment, where the population, of course, is not representative because older people tend to go on the cruise ship, and there the death rate came down to roughly 1 to 1.5%. So 1/3 of what the WHO was saying already. And these were mainly elderly people. Average age on the cruise ship was 58 years. Plus, we are getting in newer data from hotspots, and these hotspots seem to suggest that the death rate is going down once again to between 0.1 to 0.3, 0.4%. So it seems that the health consequences are less drastic than we initially expected. We have uncertainty there, I fully agree. However, due to studies in the past, we have large certainty of what it means if we boil down the economic production, and if we are not active economically. We know that GDP is very strongly associated to life expectancy. We know from long-term studies the consequences of quarantine. So these are very drastic consequences. We also seem to see, in Sweden at least, that washing your hands, isolating only the elderly, and avoid mass gatherings of more than 50 people, that seems already sufficient to more or less have the same trajectory regarding the number of deaths as Germany has. So it seems that relatively mild measures, some physical, I better should call it physical distancing and not social distancing, because it is physical distancing that's needed. We should keep our hearts and remain pro-social, of course, but everything seems to go in the direction that measures are needed, yes, but the health consequences seem to be less severe than initially thought of. I have one example of drastic side effects from Nigeria. Last week there have been 11 deaths due to COVID-19 in Nigeria. However, 13 people have been shot by the police because they broke the quarantine. Now you can always discuss about causality here, because we don't know if people are dying with coronavirus or due to coronavirus. However, the people that have been shot, they have been certainly dying due to being shot and not because of other reasons. So I really want to argue that we know the long-term consequences of economic devastation. We are uncertain about the short-term health consequences, but the short-term health consequences seem to be less severe than we initially thought. They are still severe. I'm not saying that they are not severe, but they are less severe than we thought in January. And interestingly, in January, nobody was doing something. Not the US, not Germany, etc., because we were simply uncertain. And then we had this panic reaction, I think. Yeah, and we must get out of the panic reaction and think rationally. I fully agree that all advantages and disadvantages of the measures, of the lockdown measures, but also of the alternatives must be discussed.
And we do have a growing queue, so we'll try to get as many of these as we possibly can. It looks like Johannes might be. Oh, no, it's totally fine. No, they're great answers and very helpful. But Johannes, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University. I really found it very fascinating what you had to say, and I agree with many of your points and the importance of choosing that perspective. Now, I would like to sort of expand the question a little bit beyond just the immediate sort of case of infection, because we talk about the V, right? I mean, the V response in certain ways. And since this is the Ostrom workshop, I cannot resist the temptation to ask, have you thought about how the institutional conditions, right, in different countries influence the ability to respond in such a rational way as you laid out in your paper, right? I mean, if you look across data internationally, first of all, the numbers, I mean, need to be consumed with caution, because there's no real protocols how we create those numbers. But there seems to be great variation, probably larger than what could be explained by just different ways of taking those numbers, right? And so there seems to be a link to the institutional conditions. Have you thought about this?
Yes, we even try to look at it empirically. So I think what we see is that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in countries with more stable institutions and also more trust in government, the measures will be less severe lockdown measures than in countries where trust is comparatively low. What we also observe already is that people are acting themselves individually. So once they realize, hey, this may be something dangerous, let's try to protect ourselves to some extent too, prior to the government lockdown, actually. So I, for example, in order to do my share, prior to the lockdown, I was already trying to stay at home because, of course, I can work from home. I think the institutions will matter a lot. We see in Sweden, for example, where people really trust the government, that of course also things go wrong. They have had infections in retirement homes because they brought people too early to the retirement homes. But we see that people really trust governments there, and then it's not necessary to impose drastic sanctions or drastic lockdowns because people in any case keep away a bit from each other. So this is one aspect. Then I think one needs to think, how can we learn from this crisis in order to improve institutions? I think there are two aspects. First is it is important to do benchmarking for governments. So it is important that not everybody is following the same strategy, precisely because we do not know what is right. We will find out later. And now we have the great possibility to look at different countries, at different regions, and how they responded. We also see this in Germany, where Bavaria is doing far more drastic measures than North Rhine-Westphalia. And now it seems, oh, okay, perhaps North Rhine-Westphalia has done too little, but Bavaria probably has done too much. And so we can learn from each other. And I think this benchmarking needs to be institutionalized in the future. And I would also recommend that regarding institutions, when thinking about pandemics, power is flowing to the executive, and that's a lot of power that is flowing to the executive. We should have institutional ways that those who declare the pandemic are not those who are executing the measures afterwards. So that this is institutionally different bodies, so that there should be no incentive for governments to keep the pandemic or to keep the lockdowns ongoing. It needs to be two different institutions, two different bodies that decide whether there is a pandemic and that then execute the necessary measures. So these are just the first thoughts, of course.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. Yeah, and great question, Johannes. And now, Dean?
Thanks, David. I'm going to continue with this line of thinking a little bit and ask you to say something about how the institutional structure that you'd implement this program with. You didn't mention that really, I don't think.
Yeah.
And, is it a local thing, a regional thing? How do they work together? Can we learn anything from certification programs in animal diseases? I think that's big step. It seems like kind of a, what you've got now is kind of a classic economist theoretical idea, an absence of institutions. So how would it work? What would the pitfalls be?
Yes, very important question. So we don't need an international body here, and in Europe I say we don't need a European authority that issues immunity certificates. Nation states and even regions, independent regions, autonomous regions can issue immunity certificates themselves. For example, Liechtenstein is interested in that idea. Liechtenstein has roughly 38,700 inhabitants. They will be doing testing for immunity, and they can issue their own immunity certificates, of course. It can be the prince who signs your first immunity certificate if you want to. So we are doing that already, actually. It's not so difficult. At least in advanced countries, we have established laboratories, and there is, of course, a process. You can be tested in the laboratory. The laboratory issues a report, and the report needs then be certified by a government agency, by a bureaucracy, if you want, so that the report that has been issued, that you are immune from the laboratory, that this has also legal consequences. But all this infrastructure exists, and we can even say that foreign governments can accept. I take the example of Liechtenstein, can accept the immunity certificate of Liechtenstein. For example, if you are driving too quickly, if you are driving drunk in Liechtenstein as a German, okay, and you get caught, you make a blood test. They find out, oh, well, you have been drinking too much, okay. Then, of course, the report from Liechtenstein, the laboratory report from Liechtenstein showing that you have been drunk, will go to Germany, and the Germans will fine you, okay. So this is accepted. We don't need to do anything more than just to test, to have these tests, to establish a process that these tests are not only valid, but that these tests carry legal ramifications. And then all this can be set up relatively quickly within the existing infrastructure already. That's no large problems. You can then decide whether you want an application on an app with blockchain, etc., which certifies your immunity status, or whether you think that a simple card is enough. My friend from Switzerland put it the following way. In the past, it has been the case that when you were going over a border, then you just had to wave your Swiss passport. You know, it's a passport which is red, which is red and has a white cross on it. That's the Swiss passport. I would suggest that we have a passport similar to that, but we turn it around regarding colors. It should be white with a red cross on it. And then you show this passport when you go over a border, and that's then your immunity certificate. So these infrastructures exist. They can be built on. I don't think that the organization is a large problem there. It requires resources, of course, but these resources are small in comparison to all the costs that are now incurred due to the lockdown.
That's fascinating. Great. And Jillian?
Hello. Thank you so much for this super interesting paper. I read every word of it. So I have two questions. My first question is, you mentioned about behavioral contagion, and from your description, it gives the impression that behavioral contagions are, if not all, mostly very negative. But I was thinking, what about the positive outcomes? For example, you know, higher awareness of health, better diet, positive lifestyle changes, better emotional connection between humans, greater appreciation to the environment, etc. Would this constitute, you know, positive impacts, you know, despite the COVID-19 negative impacts? And then the second question I have is, I was wondering whether immunity as a resource, can go beyond the inquiry of how we could just go back quickly to the existing way of business we've been practicing, where these societal problems like inequality, equity, environmental degradation problems were already being worsened day by day, and instead ask questions like how COVID-19 immunity as a resource may contribute to alleviating these existing problems, rather than that we avoid economic crisis and we want to go back with, framing immunity as a resource. Thank you.
Yes, we have framed, of course, behavioral contagion mainly negatively. I think we will have positive outcomes too. There will be some higher awareness of health, meaning people will tend to wash their hands more often. I have heard some news report that Boris Johnson was not known to wash his hands very regularly. So probably he will now start washing his hands more often. Prince Charles was definitely washing his hands all the time, I guess. So that's why there was so a difference in the health outcomes of the two, probably. I'm not sure if emotional connections will increase. I rather think that when you look inside families, that emotional deconnection is happening, and I expect rather divorces to increase. Children are, of course, lovely to have, but we all know, most of you know, that it's quite nice to have the children out of the house for a few hours at least a day. I'm not sure either if appreciation for the environment increases, perhaps to some extent, but of course we will, in good societies, in societies with good institutions, trust in government, etc., we will learn something out of this crisis, and there will be positive effect due to our learning. I completely agree there. So we will think a bit more about our health, etc. Again, immunity is a resource, and I think it needs to be certified. I mean, it's quite standard if you're traveling, for example, to Africa, that you are required to have a yellow fever vaccination, so immunity to yellow fever. I'm not sure if COVID-19 will alleviate other problems. I have the view rather, so the most positive outcome of COVID-19 and of this crisis would be that we see other problems rationally too in the future. I want to mention two of these problems. For example, the environment and climate change. All of us want to live in a relatively clean, nice, green environment, and we don't want to put too much burden on the future generation. Now, there we agree, but at the same time, we need to be aware of the economic costs of decreasing CO2 emissions too quickly. And this is also a rational argument, so we should not panic with climate change either, because panic is never good, but we need to take a rational picture for the situation, and then we know roughly what the solutions is. Nordhaus has got the Nobel Prize for that. It's an environmental tax, a climate tax, CO2 tax of roughly $40 per ton, increasing over time, and then demand and supply will adapt, and this will be roughly the path forward. Now you can say, well, it shouldn't be 40, it should be 50 or 60. These are minor differences. Similarly, we should think about, that's mainly for Europe, not so much for the United States, but traffic. So it's not only that individual traffic by car causes accidents and leads to exhausts, etc. But we put a lot of subsidies in Europe into public transport. And subsidies should be considered as something negative, as an externality to society. The right way would be you have to impose somewhat higher costs on car drivers to internalize the externality of environmental damage that they are doing. But at the same time, you should decrease the subsidies for public transport. So my hope is that after the crisis, at least countries with good institutions will see that rational policies are not only possible during the pandemic, but that rational policies will be pursued also in other domains. However, this will not happen everywhere. I'm relatively sure of that. So I hope we are going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Me too. How about Charles? Would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I have a question about your hypothesis 2, which is that countries where supply of health services is more elastic, where regulation of labor or other factor markets more flexible, we expect fewer deaths. But isn't that, I mean, that sort of ignores the tragedy of the commons here. And that is a criticism of a decentralized approach. You know, I'm certainly sympathetic to it, but can you expand a little bit on that? And how would you test it?
Yeah, the testing will be difficult, yes, to get to everything. No, this is our experience. We formulated that due to our experience from Europe. And we have formulated it also due to different conversations with medical doctors and also the developer actually of Tamiflu. This is Norbert Bischofberger. He is he's working in California. So Tamiflu was this medicine for the bird flu, and he's actually from the neighboring village where I come from. So now we know each other, and I've talked to him. So I mean, one reason that you are seeing this drastic, or that you have been seeing these drastic pictures from Italy, is with the military transports. Okay, so you had the deaths in the hospitals due to triage, so this was a real problem. But then you saw the military transports with the coffins. And probably, it's not yet certain, but probably the reason for this is that the people who usually, the caretakers who usually take away the dead people from the hospitals and put them to the graveyard, they striked because they didn't have any protective gear in order to transport the people. Thus, the only way for the Italians to transport the people, the dead people, to the cemeteries and was to hire the military, because these are the only ones that are flexible enough and where you can command that they should now work and they should do something. The same is, for example, for testing. We observe that in some European countries, private health providers are not allowed to test people, even if they would be willing to pay for it. So I think that's highly problematic. In Austria, skiing villages have been closed due to quarantine. These skiing villages wanted to pay for their own testing, but they were not allowed to get the private tests. So we see there that the health services were not very flexible. They were not allowed to increase due to government regulation. And I think that's a problem that I think that could be positive for the United States, because in the United States, people are used to pay for health services, and the suppliers of health services are also used to charge you, okay? However, when you are in Germany, we know that these antibody tests cost roughly 50 euros for the moment. I don't think that many Germans at the moment would be willing to pay 50 euros only to get a test. And the medical suppliers wouldn't even have the idea to ask the 50 euros. So in the short term, culture and habits play a role. So we do not have the habit in Germany to pay ex ante for our medical expenses. It's all covered, you know. And if you have a more flexible system like the US, like Switzerland, then I think it's more likely that you will see fast testing, that people go to private doctors relatively quickly, etc. I give you a personal example from my mother, very quickly only. She got a treatment prior to the corona crisis, and she got some stitches. And then everything healed very well, but she had to get out well, if you have stitches, then you have something inside, you know. And she couldn't get it out herself, so she wanted to go to the doctor, and the doctor said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't get out the stuff because I can only take COVID patients for the moment." Thus, my mother then went to a private doctor who was able to do the stuff. But the standard doctor was not allowed to get her standard medical treatment because he had to keep resources for the COVID patients that were never arriving. So I think these are consequences that you observe in countries where you have large regulation. Now, of course, the risk for my mother was very low, so she can wait and not get the treatment. But if you have 10,000 people that require that, then you will have some people that statistically develop complications. And this is a problem.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Just in the interest of time, I'm wondering maybe we could do a bit of a lightning round. Mike has to be taken off because his question was already asked. But Gustavo, Jamie, and Jeff, maybe you could each pose your questions, and then whatever you have time for or inclination, David, you can kind of weigh in from there. So Gustavo, would you like to pose yours?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Scott. Well, David, thanks for this amazing paper. So it's I was thinking how to move in the direction that you are proposing from the starting point that we have now, which is essentially that we are, in most countries, we are in a lockdown, no? Mm-hmm. So what I was thinking there is essentially, so imagine that you take just one simple variable, how to implement the change. It's like above 65, below 65, and age is the only variable, no? Just to make something very simple. So essentially, the certificates in this case will work, essentially, kind of you keep the lockdown for people above 65, but if they have a certificate of immunity, then they can join the people that can do whatever they want. If you are below 65, in some sense, the value of the certificate for interacting with people below 65, it's not of great value because anyway, the risk is like relatively low. So essentially, certificate will be working in the following ways. It's a certificate to be able to interact with people above 65.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, I was thinking more in the direction of, so I like the questions that go in the direction of the institutional features for the implementation, but I didn't have anything interesting to add in that dimension. I'm asking more on how you implement in an easy way a move in your direction, and that's what came to my mind.
Yes, very, very good. That's precisely what we have been thinking about.
Great.
To the above 65 get an immunity certificate immediately, and then they can move freely. You also want an immunity certificate, Gustavo, for the following reasons, because you want to interact with people that are older, and some people are fearful now. So if you are a hairdresser, you may want to put into your shop that you have immunity to coronavirus so that the fearful people can also come to you. Thus, I also think that the certificate is valuable also for the younger ones, not only the older ones. In restaurants where waiters can prove that they are immune, these restaurants will boom relatively quickly. So I think people want immunity because it's worth something. Yes.
Trust mechanism. Yeah. That's great. And then Jamie and Jeff?
Yeah, hi there.
Go back to back, please. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So in your abstract in your paper, you referred to some the social inequalities that can arise from like a response to coronavirus and all of that. Mm-hmm. Do you think immunity certificates could exacerbate that kind of inequality, particularly because testing is such a problem. Like in Oklahoma, our allotment of tests, like in March, like half of it was used on the Utah Jazz and Oklahoma City Thunder basketball teams. So testing has not been available here. And so you hear stories of people saying, oh yeah, maybe I did have coronavirus, just because we're going by like symptoms rather than like actual tests. So yeah, could requiring a test for immunity exacerbate social inequality if tests aren't available for people?
Mm-hmm. Should I answer?
That's great. And maybe Jeff, would you like to pose yours as well? And then David can respond to either or both, hopefully. We might have lost Jeff. Are you still on the line, Jeff? Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. I turned 7 in 1955. I grew up in the New York City area, and polio was huge. And I got my vaccine in the fall of 1955, but I don't recall the country being shut down at all. I'd visit my grandparents in Queens, and the subways were packed. People went to ball games, but the one thing, my mom would not let me go to the theater that summer to see the Walt Disney movie about Davy Crockett, which still bothers me. But the country did not shut down at all, and one could argue that polio was maybe more serious than this, and that was going to ruin kids' lives for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. I answer to that directly. I completely agree with you. We have to make comparisons. We have to make comparisons with polio. We have to make comparisons with influenza. We have to make comparisons with the Spanish influenza of 1990. At the start of the crisis, I was heavily criticized when I tried to make comparisons with the Spanish influenza of 1990. They said it's not influenza. But I think it's now coming that you can make comparisons, and we should make comparisons. For example, the comparison with influenza, just data from Germany. For the moment, we have roughly 3,000 deaths in Germany within 2 months since the start of the crisis. In 2017-18, we had 23,000 deaths due to standard influenza. So I'm not sure if we get the same numbers. I would like to highlight there that I understand why some people say it's not the same as influenza. And the reason is that normally influenza doesn't require you to have to do triage in the medical system. This virus is very specific. It's reproducing very quickly, and it's targeting your lungs. Thus, we do not have enough resources in the medical system to treat the patients that arrive with this lung disease. This way required a triage. And it seems that decision makers are mainly afraid of the triage, and they try to minimize the triage, but they should try to minimize deaths, and minimizing deaths is different to minimizing triage. And actually, we should look at life years lost. We know now from Sweden that there have been, of course, infections in retirement homes, but mainly people in Sweden go to retirement homes if they have just 4 to 6 months to live. So these people would have been dying in the next 4 to 6 months in any case. So I don't want to say that we shouldn't try to save them, but we have to change the perspective of it. And I completely agree with you that we have to make comparisons with polio or other comparisons that should be possible. Because this brings, comparison is something rational to do, and it puts the right perspective on the problem. Regarding social inequality and immunity certificates, I think, yes, initially it can be the case that immunity certificates increase inequality. But as more and more people get infected, inequality decreases again because more and more people become immune. Thus, this is like a small lottery. And again, even if you really hate inequality, then you can charge people for the immunity certificate and you can redistribute the proceeds. Now, the fact that testing is not fully available, that's a problem. A friend of mine, again working in Switzerland, He said 6 weeks ago, oh, next week I will start distributing the tests. And now 2 weeks ago, he has started distributing the tests. So they were a bit overconfident that they can do it quickly, but these tests will come certainly, and we will see mass testing unless we find out that the disease is really not that bad. But I don't think that this will be the case. It's a bad disease. We have to be careful, but it's not as bad as we expected in January and February. It's yes, we can make comparisons to influenza, I think, to pandemic influenza. And the pandemic influenza is something very bad. We have to try to avoid it.
Some cause for hope, perhaps. Well, I wish we had more time, David, because this has just been absolutely fascinating and great questions and great discussion. We'll copy the chat box as well, because there's some great, I think, additional points for discussion embedded within that. And if anybody would like to stay on the line, they're welcome to as well. I know a lot of us have other, unfortunately, Zoom meetings we have to rush off to too. But one more round of applause, David, because that was just really, really well done. Thank you again. I really, really appreciate it. I know we all do. And if you have any closing remarks or comments for the group?
No, it was, as always, very enjoyable with the Austrian workshop. Great organization, everything's running smoothly, and great questions too. I hope I have defended our approach well, and I think we will see it coming. I have heard that Chile is trying to implement it, and now also the Brits are discussing. And if I remember correctly, Anthony Fauci was skeptical, but it's at least in the discussion in the US. I have to admit, I have a nightmare. And my nightmare is that I wake up in the morning and I check the Twitter account and I see Donald Trump tweeting that he has thought about the problem and he has come up with the solution. It's immunity certificate. That would be my nightmare, of course. But we'll see if this is happening.
No, that's fair. A lot of us might have similar nightmares, perhaps, involving our dear leader. But that's another discussion for another day. Thank you so much. That was really, really well done, David. And thanks as well to David Price for handling the logistics and making all this happen for us. Very much appreciated. Just as a few quick reminders, guys, this is the official kind of end, unfortunately, of the Colloquium series for the spring. But stay tuned, because we will have various other events happening virtually for the time being, of course. For example, there'll be more announcements going out about this, but we're planning a conference to re-engage in particularly the EU-based affiliates, ideally a virtual one in November, then an in-person one at the IU Berlin Gateway next April. So that'll be another opportunity to continue the conversation, and that's part of our 30-year celebrations involving governing the commons, which will hopefully involve a conference here at the workshop in Bloomington as well. So, we'll see how that plays out in the fall, or if we need to push it back to the spring there too. So stay tuned for those things. Remember as well, if anybody's interested, we are holding our second and final Cyber Peace Colloquium this coming Friday morning. So that was a lot of fun this past Friday. So if you're interested in peace and security issues in the cyber context, we welcome that. And for what it's worth, lastly, David, I thought this might be a really fruitful topic for even a working group that we might want to form, because my goodness, there's so many directions we can take it. As you said, the technical aspects of blockchain, a lot of trust issues and otherwise. So maybe we can
very important to bring in different views from sociologists, etc. So the Austrian workshop is a very good place to do that.
Exactly. I frankly couldn't agree more. Right. So we might stay tuned on that as well, because I think that would be great. And of course, the working groups will keep active over the summer here. So if you haven't checked out that list for a while, it's growing. There's more than a dozen now. So do take a look at that too. A lot of ways to get involved. So thank you so much again, David. Thanks again to all of you. Be safe, be well. We look forward to seeing you hopefully in person very soon. But if not, then via the magic of Zoom. So thank you so much again for tuning in, and thank you for the great presentation, David.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Stay here. Okay. That was a very good remark, yes.
Looks like people are dropping off rather rapidly here.
Yeah, it's good.
If nobody else has anything to say, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting.
Okay, fine.
All right. Thanks, David. It was awesome. I paid attention. I usually don't pay attention to these things, but it was quite interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Will you put up the video online?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I will. You're okay with that? I'll put everything up online. It'll be up this afternoon or tomorrow morning.
Is this paper, are you submitting it for publication? Is this going for a grant? Are you actually trying to get data on this? What is this paper?
Yes, yes, we have already published it actually. It's forthcoming, or it's forthcoming in Kyklos, and now we are building on it. So we have data already together with Australian colleagues, where we analyze whether the measures had real behavioral consequences. So this is the first thing we are doing. We are looking at institutions and we are trying to see whether the measures that have been introduced depend on the institutions in place. I'm very careful there for the moment because the data on measures is relatively bad. I know it from here in Germany because my wife is actually working for the Ministry, for the Bavarian Ministry of Health. And she tells me, so she is a lawyer, and she tells me, well, David, you have to be very careful when you are trying to analyze the government measures because the measure is out, the law is out, and then the courts, so it's the courts decide on it. And we have had at least 3 measures in Germany, which have, after 3 days or 4 days, have been annulled by the courts. So they are not valid anymore. And then they had the new measures. So whenever you see data currently, Oxford has data on government measures and laws and regulations. This is not very good data, it seems. So we have a problem there. What we are doing instead is we are saying, well, let's look at mobility patterns of people, and let's check how mobile the people are. We have some. I think we were very, very quick. I don't want to say it was good to what I said, but I had very quickly this point of view. You need to think about perceptions and not only about actual risk, but how do people perceive the stuff.
Sure.
So we have exactly.
Is certificates possible? Is there any planning going on for it? An immune passport?
Yes, it is. In Austria, the how is it called? Well, a government agency that prints the passport is working together with a startup company, and they are thinking about the immunity passport on an app. Then you have this Swiss. So I only know the stuff that is happening in my vicinity. I don't know what's happening in the United States for the moment. You have Liechtenstein that is really considering it. It's in yes, so they are really considering it. Of course, it's a very small country, but they can be a game changer because Liechtenstein is dependent on. So there are 40,000 inhabitants in Liechtenstein, and daily they have in-migration of commuters of 40,000 people.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And the good thing is, if they implement it, it puts enormous pressure on the neighboring countries to implement it too.
Sure.
So this is, once you get it going, then it goes. I'm trying to influence my home region, but I'm not getting through there.
We'll have a pandemic of immunity certificates.
Yes, yeah, but we have, we have it. Even if we get vaccination, then we will need a vaccination certificate.
Absolutely.
So it's quite logical.
It's going to happen.
The only thing that can happen is.
Yeah, my dogs are barking. I gotta go. Thank you so much, David. It's good to meet you. Okay.
No worries. Thanks. Perfect. Jeff, I can't hear you.
Thank you very much. I gotta get going. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes.
All right, David. I'm putting an end to it.
I put an end. Good. Thank you, David, and we keep in touch.
Yeah, we will. We'll see you. All right.
See you.
Bye.